along with Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads and particular passages from Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Shelley's 1821 essay, Defense of Poetry, is one of the major documents of romantic poetical theory. In other words, a document that tries to lay out the basic principles of how a mind creates a poem, what a poem is, and how a poem affects its audience. So if you read Defense of Poetry, you see fairly quickly in the first 2 pages some ideas that Shelley shares with Wordsworth and Coleridge. In particular, you see in the first paragraph Shelley talking about two aspects of the mind: the part of the mind that divides up, that analyzes, the part of the mind that unifies or synthesizes. And certainly we see Coleridge in the famous book 13 of Biographia Literaria talking about imagination as this synthesizing principle in the mind. And then in the second paragraph, even, or maybe it's a little further down, uh, Shelley talks about the mind as an Aeolian harp. And we see certainly Coleridge imagine the mind and indeed everything as an Aeolian harp in his 1795 poem, Aeolian Harp. The idea that the imagination is very open and sensitive to external energies, but has the power to shape those energies into sound to harmonize them. So those are just two of the ideas in Defense that we've seen before. But Shelley is not simply repeating Wordsworth and Coleridge. He's interested in poetry not just as an aesthetic power, but also he's interested in the ethics of poetry. Now, certainly Wordsworth and Coleridge are as well, but Shelley's a much more politically engaged poet. He's a reformer. He wants to reform the world. He wants to make the world better for other people. He's a very progressive, egalitarian, radical even thinker, and was from the very beginning in his earliest verse. So when he says something like poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, he is saying something, of course, rather hyperbolic. It appears that poets have no political power whatsoever. But the way Shelley defines poetry suggests that indeed poets have immense political power, because it is the poets that generate the language required to describe the world, and therefore poets that ultimately can shape the way we see the world, experience the world. So I'm going to talk about 3 particular moments in Defense of Poetry that I think will get to the flavor of the essay and show where Shelley veers a little bit from Wordsworth and Coleridge. So I want to begin first near the end, the paragraph beginning with "Poetry is indeed something divine." If you have the same edition, the Norton, the most recent Norton, it's paragraph 39, where Shelley says this: "A man cannot say, 'I will compose poetry.' The greatest poet, even, cannot say it. For the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, like the color of a flower, which fades and changes as it is developed, as the conscious portions of our nature are unprophetic either of its approach or its departure. Could this influence be durable in its original purity and force, it is impossible to predict the greatness of the results. But when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline, and the most glorious poetry that has ever been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conception of the poet." We've seen language like this in the preface to Coleridge's Kubla Khan, where Coleridge, of course, says that this poem came to him in a dream. He didn't ask for it to come. He didn't try to make it come. It simply came spontaneously. But the minute he started to write it down, the poem he had in his dream, it started fading away. So here Shelley suggests the same thing, that the greatest poems we do not will, we do not try to make. They come to us as if our mind were a slowly fading coal, getting ready to extinguish itself, when suddenly inspiration, breath, wind hits the coal and strikes it into flame. And that's the flame of inspiration. In other words, poetry comes unbidden, again, spontaneously, and it is beyond our self-consciousness. It is beyond our deliberations. It is beyond our will. But the minute we start writing the poem down, the inspiration is already fading. The flame is already sinking back down into the coal to become an ember. In other words, poems really are mysterious. They are not ordinary. They are not of the everyday. They are special, intense occasions where powers that we cannot predict and cannot control come and crackle through us, and we, if we are quick enough, write down the rhythm of that crackle, as it were. So this ties in with a lot of ideas in this essay, and ideas that I'll include under I guess the concept of the poetry, the poem, the effect of the poem, are ultimately powers of defamiliarization. If I'm in a familiar mood, if I am existing in a kind of everyday way, habitual, conventional, I will not write poetry in those moods, Shelley suggests. It's only when I feel weird, when my normal relationship to the world is altered, twisted, torqued, agitated. It's in those moments when these powers, these strange powers, come unbidden. That is the moment when the poem can come to be. Shelley makes it very clear over on page 533 in the Norton is paragraph 41, where he says this: poetry turns all things to loveliness. It exalts the beauty of that which is most beautiful, and it adds beauty to that which is most deformed. It marries exultation and horror, grief and pleasure, eternity and change. It subdues to union under its light yoke all irreconcilable things. It transmutes all that it touches, and every form moving within the radiance of its presence is charged by wondrous sympathy to an incarnation of the spirit which it breathes. Its secret alchemy turns to potable gold the poisonous waters which flow from death through life. It strips the veil of familiarity from the world and lays bare the naked and sleeping beauty which is the spirit of its forms. And later on in the next paragraph, paragraph 42, he says that poetry reproduces the common universe of which we are portions and percipients. It reproduces the common universe of which we are portions and percipients, and it purges from our inward sight the film of familiarity which obscures from us the wonder of our being. So there's that word twice. That the world for most of us seems ordinary, predictable, ruled by habits, ordinary, not interesting, boring. We are dead to the world because we inhabit the same world almost every day, all the time, and it seems to us, been there, done that, same old stuff. But sometimes the poet, the artist, can make the familiar appear in an unfamiliar way, can defamiliarize the familiar. This is language I'm borrowing from a school of literary criticism in the early 20th century known as Russian formalism. The idea that the poet can name the world in such a way so what we thought we knew, we don't really know that well. And suddenly the world becomes interesting to us again. It's as if we can see it as something we want to engage in and care about and be compassionate about. You can think of any number of times you've probably read a poem, say Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and you go out and look at grass, and grass is different to you. Or Dickinson's There's a Certain Slant of Light, and suddenly light coming through the window is different to you. These are moments where what was boring suddenly becomes striking because the poet shines a different light on what we've been looking at maybe our whole lives, and now we see it as if we're seeing it for the very first time. So the mind is slowly fading cold, suddenly, unpredictably inflamed with inspiration. That's a kind of defamiliarization of the familiar, just in terms of how our mind relates to the world. And then the poet ripping away the veil of familiarity from the world and helping us via the poem see the world as it were for the first time, and it becomes alive and interesting to us. We care about it again, and this idea of care is very important. This is the third point I want to bring across or discuss from this essay. Let me see here, and this is where Shelley says, and this is page 517, paragraph 13, it says, "A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight." How is poetry the instrument of moral good? What thwarts our morality? One might say the mind's propensity to stereotype, to look at a person and to reduce that person to a particular ideology or a particular group, in particular a particular ethnic group. And if I'm unable to see you as an individual, but only see you as a type of a group, then I'm less likely to care about you as an individual. I'm less likely to have compassion. And indeed, we can see how reducing an individual to a group in a stereotypical way is part of racism or sexism or classism. But Shelley says if I can imagine what it's like to be you to the best of my ability, obviously I can't do that entirely, but if I can imagine what it's like to be you or try to imagine what it's like to be you, then I will try to grasp you as a particular individual, unprecedented, unrepeatable, utterly idiosyncratic. And that is the moment when I will have a desire to treat you with compassion, where I will want to treat you the same way I want you to treat me. So in this regard, imagination, the ability to try to envision what it's like to be an other, is the core of morals. So this is yet another way that the poem defamiliarizes the familiar. Just when I think I've gotten you figured out and you're no longer interesting to me, or I've reduced you to just a group, just when I think that's the case, the poem can come along, or the imagination can come along and strip away that veil of familiarity I think I have, that understanding I think I have, and suddenly you appear to me as strange and interesting and engaging, engrossing, and something a person I want to be curious about and care about. So there's just 3 points in Defense of Poetry by Shelley, 1821, that I think, of course, shows him sharing some ideas with Wordsworth and Coleridge, but ultimately in his interest in the political, the ethical, much more extreme, much more intense than the same kind of interest in Wordsworth and Coleridge. I think it is those two parts, the ethical, the political, that distinguish Shelley from Wordsworth and Coleridge, not in kind, but in degree.